The Dirt with me, Mike Howell, an economics podcast where I present the down and dirty agronomic science to help grow crops and bottom lines. Inspired by economics.com, farming's go-to informational resource, I'm here to break down the latest crop nutrition research, news, and issues, helping farmers make better business decisions through actionable insights. Let's dig in. Well, listeners, we promised you something exciting in this week's episode, and here it is. I'm pleased to let you know that we have Mark Sutherland with us today. Mark is a second-generation Chuckwagon racer, and he's been doing this for about 30 years. Mark, welcome to The Dirt.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mark, I've seen Chuckwagon races on TV and even in person a time or two, and it just amazes me how fast y'all are able to drive those wagons around the arena. From my vantage point, it looks like you're just sitting there on the edge of out of control. For our listeners that haven't seen Chuckwagon racing and don't know anything about it, if you would, kind of tell us what Chuckwagon racing is and what's the purpose of it.
You bet. It is basically a Western Canadian event. It started back about 100 years ago. I think it probably started before that, but the gentleman that made it famous is Guy Wiedeck. He landed in this area, decided that the old stagecoaches and the old chuck wagons, the food wagons, the camp wagons from moving the cattle would be a pretty interesting sight if you raced the cattle camps against each other. Folklore says that was happening out on the range as the guys would move their cows. Everybody'd get a little bored and they'd start kind of chasing each other and racing these wagons. I can't imagine with the technology back in the late 1800s what that looked like, but I think he made it famous. I guess at the Calgary Stampede started in 1912 and then wagons were about 10 years after. So this has been 100 years. And what we do now is they're all very standard built. They're still made out of the traditional design, which is 4 wooden wagon wheels. We did change to steel axles for safety. And we have a wagon. It looks like an old food wagon that you would move or a grain box on it. We sit on top and we have 4 thoroughbred racehorses attached to the front, 2 and 2. Now, it's a faster event than it used to be due to training, feeding, and quality of animal that we purchase and train to do this event. They're all thoroughbred racehorses off of the racetracks. The Chuckwagon drivers travel all across North America. It's not something that you raise your own horses. I wintered 44 head myself. My son also races. He wintered 27 head, meaning we keep them for the year, and that's what starts your spring training camp. So I started spring training with 44 head. And then from those 44, you pare down. It's similar to any other sports team. You pare down who's best, who's not, what position they go in. And you find the best one in that position, and he's the one you're going to race on barrel 1 at the Calgary Stampede. Now, we do have 10 other events all across Western Canada throughout the summer. Years ago, we used to race down in the States, but logistics, it just becomes a bit of a nightmare. I can't imagine it being any better now than it was 10 years ago. So, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of big races in the States, but we do race in Canada. The gist of the sport is it shows skill, horsemanship, steering, driving, and then training and caretaking of the horses. The object is just a speed race. So you're racing against your competitor, but there's 27 guys and only generally 3 at the Calgary Stampede are on the track at once. Some of the other races have 4 at once. And although you are trying to race against the individuals that are in your heat, you are racing against the clock and you want to be the fastest out of the guys that go that night. What you do is you go up and you make a figure 8. You can do it as fast as you can. There's some skill involved in that. And I guess we do it about 15 miles an hour is where they turn the top part of the figure 8. And by the time we come down around the bottom of the figure 8, we're doing that 32 miles an hour. And then we'll peak at about 42 miles an hour in the second turn will be our maximum speed. The fastest and best wagons, they'll reach that max speed early. And they'll maintain as close as they can for as long as they can. In a horse race, people are familiar with the Kentucky Derby and races like that. You'll see a long shot come from behind. Same with chuck wagons. You will see somebody, they call it a finishing kick, but they're never going as fast as they were in the second turn. So it isn't really a finishing kick. That is where you're training. The horse is just plain ability and obviously good feed and then just good horse selection. That's where you get a finishing kick. But the horses don't actually speed up on the home stretch. They're actually probably 5 to 8 miles an hour slower on the home stretch, depending on track conditions and length of the track. First one across the track without penalties, bumping a barrel or getting out of your lane or messing with anybody, that's strictly enforced. and punishable, well, you could be suspended. There's obvious safety of the horses is utmost right now, and it has been, thankfully, for my career, 30 plus years. But I suspect back in the 1800s, they looked at things differently, but thank goodness we've got some technology and just some awareness. And fastest guy that has no penalties gets to wave the most to the crowd and collect all the cash.
Mark, you touched on a lot of subjects and actually touched on a lot of the questions I have listed here today that I wanted to talk about. You mentioned that those horses will reach a top speed of about 42 miles an hour. I had no idea they were going quite that fast, but I've watched the Chuckwagon races mostly on television. Is that something that's becoming a part of most rodeos now, or is that just at selected events that they have the Chuckwagon races?
We go at selected events, and the reason being is I'm hauling 27 horses to 35, somewhere in that range to each event. It's not like a team roper or a bull rider that just takes his bull rope. A team roper takes one or two horses, maybe a rookie or two competition horses if he switches them out. We're traveling with 27 head, so we don't bounce from day to day like a typical rodeo event. When we go to an event, we're there for hopefully 3 to 5 days, 10 days at the Calgary Stampede, 6 days at the Ponoka Stampede, which we just finished. That would be the biggest race in Canada, would be the Ponoka Stampede, outside of Calgary, of course. Again, there's a certain number of us that can do this. There are pony chuckwagons all across North America as well. And those horses are just that. They're a pony horse. They're getting to the point where they breed kind of stunted thoroughbreds as well, stunted growth thoroughbreds. I'm not familiar, to be honest, with the sport that they do that well. But so people would have seen that possibly. But we are just at major rodeos in Western Canada. And some of the events aren't even rodeos. It's a standalone event. We do chuckwagon races. They might hold a conference or a concert or beer gardens or whatever they do, a couple concerts. And we go to 11 places. We start racing right around that final week in May, depending on the schedule. And every week we travel to a new location and set up camp and race our hearts out.
Mark, let's talk a little bit about the horses. You already mentioned the safety factors that go into it, and you can get some penalties if some unsafe things are going on. But first, I know there's a lot of people out there that dislike the sport of rodeo and the events associated with it, and they say that the animals are being mistreated and abused. And now, in my experience, I've been around a few places, and I can say that I've seen barns that are better equipped than my house. I've seen some of the air-conditioned trailers that these animals ride around in. I know they get regular vet visits. And of course, they've got the best nutrition that you can possibly find and so much more. What would you say to people that have this negative view about the sport of rodeo in general, and how can we get them convinced that these animals are really being taken care of properly?
Well, I think education is the key. I think the Western events people, although Western events would be cattle penning and to some people and rodeo and chuckwagons, those are Western events. To me, they're horse events, equine events. So even jumping, which they're not Western people, they ride English and they do a lot of different things, but those are all horse events. To me, anyone that's working like myself with horses or a working cowboy, they love animals. I mean, that's why I'm doing it. If I wanted to race cars, I would. I don't want to race NASCAR. I don't want to drag race. I don't want to do that stuff. I reached the pinnacle of chuckwagon racing because I've worked hard and I love animals, and that's what I want to do. So these folks that are concerned about the health and safety and the care of animals are sometimes our allies, and that's where I think we're kind of going a little bit off base. Now, if they're not there for improvement of the sport and the care of the animals, then they're not our allies. They're not animal lovers. They're political protesters or whatever the reasons are, I don't know. But I've met a number of people that are self-proclaimed, for lack of a better term, animal lovers, but they hate the sport. They hate rodeo, they hate chuckwagons, they hate this stuff. And I've educated them and I've explained to them and showed many of them through social media, which is, well, I'm grateful for, just because we can get our message out there, and other avenues, that we're allies in this. We're allies in taking care of horses. I'm not going to pretend that animals don't get injured during competition events, because you'll go to a world-class jumping. You can watch the Olympics when they're jumping, which they were in some of the Olympics here. And you can watch world-class events, and animals have a potential to get injured during competition. But what we need to do is deal with decision-making that causes those injuries, and eliminate those decisions. What we need to do is ensure that the Kentucky Derby has the safest racing surface that they deem safe. And horse events all across North America are doing this. The Calgary Stampede is doing this. We need to ensure that the track surface is safe. The horses are trained and fit. The nutrition is there. You can imagine if you're training, owning, feeding 44 head of horses, that's not a $2,000 a year bill. That's a $200,000 a year bill, in excess of that. This isn't a pastime. We don't do this to abuse horses, and we don't do this to hurt them. And if for no other reason, this is what I try to explain to some of these folks. If you're a cold-hearted, callous individual, which I'm not, and I don't believe a lot of people are that are in equine sports, they're doing it because they love the animal. But just to say hypothetically, if you're a cold-hearted, mean individual and all you care about is money and winning, why would you affect one of your assets so greatly? That's like taking the greatest hockey player or baseball player out in the world and making that guy pitch 2 games in a row and blowing his shoulder. Why would you do that? If there's no other reason, like love for an animal, which we have, I mean, that's why I do it. If there's no other reason, it doesn't make sense. So it's a bit of a straw man argument that some of these folks have, and it can be easily, with education, with just giving that person access and showing them what we're doing and explaining the checks and balances that we have in our sport. Now, I always open up for discussion, for explanation, and for education when it comes to horse safety, when it comes for improvement, continuous improvement of the sport, anything. I've been on the forefront of 9 published University of Calgary equine studies to do with horse health. This is something that I've devoted my life to. So I don't have an issue with that. The people that I don't want to engage with discussing it is people who aren't trying to improve the sport, people who are trying to eliminate the sport. If you don't believe that animals should be pets like dogs or horses should have a life, my theory is horses having a life racing on the racetrack and then transitioning to chuckwagon races, or a quarter horse that gets to chase cows and row professionally. To me, that's a better life than having no life at all. And if some of these folks are thinking that we just shouldn't have these animals, then I can't help them. They're beyond help. I can't educate them.
I understand. Mark, you talked about entering spring training and the number of horses you had. If you will, talk a little bit about the training routine that these animals go through and their exercise program. How do you get them ready for the race?
They're a little bit different than a thoroughbred, racetrack thoroughbred. As I mentioned, they all come off of racetracks across North America. But our horses will be a little bit heavier. They'll be a little bit older. The Kentucky Derby, for those that don't know, is a 3-year-old race. I'm racing an 18-year-old horse at the Calgary Stampede. And I know everyone will say, oh, wait a minute, what's this hillbilly doing? Well, I don't have a lot of 18-year-olds. I have a super athlete that is Michael Jordan, LeBron James, whatever. I don't know any sports references that the folks know, but he's the old guy that can do it. Now, there's lots of 12-year-olds in my sport that aren't as good as him, and they've finished their career. But our horses are big, thick, strong because they're 8, 10, 12, 14-year-old horses. The horses at the racetrack are 2 to typically 5 years old. They race once every 3 weeks, and they're at a peak performance. Ours, I'll have to race a couple times in 4 days here at the Calgary Stampede with each individual horse. You'll have to have 2 runs. I really don't want that horse to be peak performance that first run. It's more of an exercise run. When we train in the spring, I know that sounds silly because you go to win, but you go to win, it's an aggregate, and then you go to win the dash. So you kind of have to plan your training that way. You work on the cardio. So we just do slow miles, galloping. We have a setup where we do that. And some guys use the equicizers with the wheels. Some guys just drive them. There's different ways to do it. But what you need cardiovascular and muscle for these horses. And my theory is before you're kind of really running them, you're giving them 30 to 40 days of pretty good training. And then you let them run a short distance. They're happy with that. They're athletes. They want to run, but they think they can run a mile. They can only run a quarter mile. These thoroughbreds are just like children, and you have to teach them and you got to show them. If you let them run, I suspect they'd run as far as they could and till they're exhausted. So that's what we do. We give them that slow miles, which would be the cardio and the muscle training. And then we hook them on the wagon once every 4 to 6 days, again, kind of depending on your spraying and depending on weather. And then that helps them work the specific muscle groups, which would be the hind end, the shoulder, whatever it is. It's a different deal galloping without pulling and not running. We do the two different types of training, which is basically a cardio. And then, don't misunderstand. When they go on that wagon, they're breathing heavy when they're done. It's a good work. But we don't do that every day because you can't. That's just not how you train. You don't scrimmage every day when you're a hockey player. You don't play a game every day when you're a hockey player. You skate laps. And sometimes it's slow laps, sometimes it's fast burst. They're mammals. The horses are a lot like humans. We actually adapt some of the training that people do. You're looking at aerobic and anaerobic training. You're looking at fast burst. Generally, what we find is just like in sport, human sport, some athletes have it and some don't. You can get by with a horse with a lot of heart and a lot of try. But if you have a horse with a lot of heart and he has all that physical ability as well, then that's where you build your superstars. And we can pretend that we're the super trainer and we're the smart guy and we're doing all this stuff. And sometimes you just get lucky and get two of them. You train them how you want to, but they're getting ready themselves and they know what they're doing. And I've been blessed with a lot of those superstars in my career, and thank goodness I've got a couple right now.
Mark, you compared the horses to humans, and I understand that. I grew up on a farm, and we had cattle and horses, and always appreciated those animals. But one thing I picked up on at an early age is all these animals have their own personality. Now, you're trying to drive a team with 4 different horses that have a different personality. How do you go about blending those different personalities together and make them into a team that each does their own function?
It's like a offensive line in football. I keep making sports references, but that's the only way I can explain it to people. And you can have 2 superstars on that offensive line, but you got a bad offensive line. The reason is because they don't work together. And if you're lucky and you get the personalities and the movements and the skill ability and the way they like to turn and the way they like to run, you can team those horses up. If you happen to get 2 superstars or 3 superstars or 4, which is difficult. Look, I got some nice horses, but I don't have 4 superstars that I race on one outfit. I just don't, because a superstar is a superstar. The rest are just really, really good horses. If you're lucky and you got a couple of them and they work together, that's just how you succeed. And it's trial and error. It's recognizing what that horse's ability is, the way he starts, the way he turns, the way he charges around that top barrel, where he places on the track, where he exerts his effort. Because again, I'm driving 4 of them, so I can kind of rate them a little bit, but it's virtually impossible to rate 4 horses separately. So if somebody's galloping a horse or running a horse and you're sitting on his back, you can rate that one horse and you can, without a doubt, control that horse, tell him when to go fast and when to go slow. I can tell at best 2 because of the way that the wagon is set up. I can say, look, guys, here's your signal. Now you know well enough. Slow down a little bit. Let's just take a breather. We got another 40 seconds of racing, and here's what you need to do. And I can only do that through a flick of the wrist or a pull of the finger on the reins. And that's why this personality and putting this team together is so important, because if they don't work together and you can't match the abilities, the skills, and the personalities, then they're just not going to be a successful team.
Mark, I really appreciate that offensive line analogy you made there. I'm an old offensive lineman, and I've got a son that just graduated from high school that was a pretty good offensive lineman. But that's right. If you don't have the right people around you, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're not going to get the job done. Mark, you kind of mentioned nutrition on these horses a time or two. Let's talk a little bit about nutrition and what kind of diet these animals are getting. How do you choose a good feed? How do you get quality hay, and what goes into that?
Well, for me, I know there's a lot of folks out there that use bagged, packaged, premixed products. That has never really worked for me. And a lot of it is just simple numbers. I started training with 44. I whittled that down. Let's just say I had 35, 40 horses, 36, something like that. I start training. Now, those horses get fed throughout the day, right? I can't take 900 bags of a premix feed and then feed each horse. So I start with a good cleaned oat. For me, it's necessity that it's cleaned. It's a heavy oat. The breed of oat is important, but not earth-shattering. We can get protein tests on all of it. Lots of times, if I'm able to find it, I'll feed a seed oat. I like a big, thick, plump oat. I like it to be cleaned. And I start with that. In the off season, which these horses have essentially from September 1st all the way to March 1st, my horses are on a complete 100% self-feed oat. So there will be 300 or 400 bushels of oats in tubs all across my pastures. And then there'll be 6 or 8 tubs of self-feed second cut alfalfa. And that's how they winter. That's how they off-season. Grass doesn't do it for a thoroughbred racehorse that is trying to be a chuckwagon horse. They build their muscle by their protein that they ingest. And you can have the best grass in the world, but for a thoroughbred athlete, you need that real protein that's in the grain. Grass is a 100% necessity for a thoroughbred horse, but it's a supplement. I always approach a nice green grass field pasture as a mental thing for a thoroughbred horse. They love to go out and pick at the roots and eat the grass and find the sweet spots. But when their stomach needs the food, the meat, the beef, they don't eat beef, they eat oats. So when we start training, then we put them in the barn and we ration them because some horses are easier keepers. Some horses are wide receivers and some horses are offensive linemen. And you need them both, just like you do in a football team. And I've got an older outriding horse, and he looks like a pregnant mare about 8-9 months of the year. For the folks that don't know, these are all gelded thoroughbreds. So I don't have any pregnant mares. And I've got a big gelding that I race on the Chuckwagon, and he looks like a pregnant mare about 11 months a year. And right now is sort of his peak season, and he sort of starts slimming down. But slim for him is not a Speedo look. It's a full-on bathing suit because he's just such a girthy, big horse. So when I start training with those horses, again, you're talking about a 12 or 14-year-old horse. You need to get the weight off them so that their joints, so that their feet, their heart and lungs can take it. So I'll ration the feed with some of them, and then some of these other ones with higher metabolism, when they get their lunch oats and breakfast and supper, they'll get more. I don't feed a supplement for breakfast or lunch, but I feed supplements with the oats mixed for supper. And this time of season, and actually for the last month at least, what I've been doing is they'll get 3 gallons of oats in their supper mash. They get an electrolyte, which is obviously a necessity. That's a supplement that we just add on. We'll get a protein pellet. When I look at what's in the protein, where they're getting the protein from, for a racehorse like a thoroughbred chuckwagon horse, I'm not a big fan of pea protein. I know that it's got its place, but it doesn't have its place in my barn for a protein supplement. So I'm very careful what minerals and supplements go in my pellets. I have a product I like, and that's the one I use. And there's other drivers that use other stuff. I also like a little bit of oil, so I'll use a canola oil. I just use food grade. I buy it from the grocery store. That helps with their shine. That helps with their coat. It helps with their stomach. I don't put a lot in, but I put a little bit in. Then I'll add a little bit of flaxseed, and I use a whole flaxseed. I've tried both for years. The whole flax is much, much better. Again, through my years of learning, it's my understanding that the way that the horse's stomach works, I don't use a rolled oat because they're not like a cow. When you go out in your pasture or your corrals, you'll be looking at the horse manure and it looks like there's whole oats sitting in the horse manure and you're thinking, oh man, why I'm wasting it. But they're getting that protein. There's no value in the hull of an oat for a thoroughbred horse. The fiber that he needs comes from the hay. And in some cases, they'll chew on the straw. I think that's more of a nervous thing. So the fiber that they need comes from the hay. The protein comes from the meat of the oat. So I don't use a rolled oat. I don't feel that the rolled oat is the way to go with the horses. And I don't feel, for some reason, the cracked flaxseed, you don't get the same result. So I use a whole seed. They grind it up a little bit. But the interesting part I found about their stomach is when it soaks in there for the short period of time, they get what they need out of it. It's amazing that the way that these animals were created. And once you figure that out, it's pretty easy. A lot of these horses I've had for a number of years. So I know their habits. I know what they need to eat. I know what extra supplements they get. I also do a powdered mineral. Some people use a liquid mineral. I stay away from sugary things like molasses. I used to use that in a mineral, but I don't anymore. I'll do an additive of a mineral and a little bit of salt. And then depending on individual horses, they'll get an individual supplement. And it could be anything. I give amino acids to some horses. There's a nice feed product that I use on certain horses, and it's got a bunch of amino acids and muscle builders in it. And it's a wonderful product. And I only use it on certain horses, and it can be overused, so you don't overuse it. Again, I got 35 of these athletes on my team. I can't imagine a football team. Well, again, I hate to go back to the offensive linemen, but the NFL nutritionists are not feeding the offensive linemen the same way and pushing food down their throat and making them eat to gain the weight the same way that they're training and feeding a wide receiver. They're just not. And tight ends are different than receivers, and tight ends are different than running backs. And these horses are the same because, first of all, their body type. Second of all, the job I want them to do. And third, their metabolism. Horses have a palate as well, their individual palate. And you might want to stick a bunch of electrolytes in a horse, but he don't like the taste and he won't eat it. He doesn't like the salty taste. So how do you do it? Well, you got to figure it out. You got to be smarter than a horse, which isn't easy all that often. But you got to either give him a different electrolyte or you got to give it to him in a paste. You have to help the horse when he won't help himself. And that's a high level summary. My son likes a little bit of a different mix, and he's using a soaked beet pulp. He likes the beet pulp. I don't. Corn is not a diet for these horses anymore. There used to be the odd guy that put a little corn and barley, but you can herd a thoroughbred's feet with corn and barley. Thankfully, lessons learned from our ancestors in the last 100 years of training these horses. I don't have to go through that. The odd time, and I've experienced it once in my career, and my son has one horse. The odd time you'll have a horse that is somehow allergic to oats. And then you have to completely throw everything I said out the window, get him all them supplements, all those minerals, the amino acids, the electrolytes, and you got to get him some protein so he can build some muscle mass. And then you just have to use a different product for him.
Mark, that's where our worlds come together. You talked a lot about the high levels of protein you need to build these muscles and the amino acids. And that's where my job is making sure we get the nitrogen fertilizer onto these crops to make sure that we have the high protein that these horses are going to need. For our listeners that were wondering how we were going to tie this back together, that's how it all ties back together between the horse racing and the agronomy side of it. Mark, I understand this is going to be your last season driving the Chuckwagons. Are you still going to be around helping your son, or are you going to hang it up altogether?
Gosh, I don't know. This has been part of my life for my entire life. My father raced Chuckwagons before I was born. I'm 52 years old. My first July 1st, I spent at the Ponoka Stampede, and I was a mere 6 or 8 months old. And up until they shut everything down a couple of years ago, I'd never missed a Ponoka Stampede. So that would be, in my mind, that would be akin to people never being anywhere except one particular spot July 4th. July 1st for me, I'd never been anywhere except the Ponoka Stampede. I got a lot of history doing that. So it's going to be hard to step away. And the worst part is the horses. I'm going to retire a couple. I'm going to try to sell a couple to my son and try to get them to other people that I trust and respect. But letting go of my team is the biggest issue, and I can't retire them all because regardless of how much I would like to and how good the fertilizer's working on my hay, it's too expensive for me to have lawn ornaments, so I just can't do it. I've got 5 or 6 that are retired at the ranch, and I've done that over the last 20 or 30 years. They'll die there, and that's just the way it is. But I don't know how much I'm going to spend around. I'm going to try to help my son as best I can. I suspect it's going to be a little hard to be sitting in the stands. I admire guys like Terry Bradshaw that can sit in the booth and talk about quarterbacks and football, and I don't know if I'm that guy. I get mad when I watch a Chuckwagon race and I'm not in it. My plan is to do a little bit of fishing and get to a few more live NFL games in the summertime and the fall and help where I can. My life's been about horses. We're going to have horses. My son's going to have horses. I'm going to help him as best I can. And I don't know, you kind of got me tongue-tied because it's a transition that I think I'm ready for, but I know I'm not.
I understand. It's always tough walking away from something you love like that. So, Mark, final question, and I know you've got a lot to do getting ready for the next race, but if you would, think back over your 30 years racing or 30-plus years racing, what's the most memorable event you participated in? What one event stands out?
Announcing retirement allows for reflection. Somebody interviewed me this spring and said, well, are you going to have some memories and when you go to your last time at the Grand Prairie Stampede, which was my hometown in Alberta, or the Ponoka Stampede, which I won in 2019. I lost by 3/100ths of a second to my father in about 2015, and I think I lost it again earlier than that. I've got a lot of memories. And I told him, I don't think I'm going to have a lot of reflection running around the racetrack going down the back stretch. And if I do, I'll be going too slow. But that wasn't necessarily true because it isn't the races you remember. It's the people. But one of the advantages of growing old, I was able to have mentors in the sport. I was able to grow up with them. Some of them are still around. Most of them aren't competing anymore. I've spent my life with those people, with my family. They've traveled with me. My son's now in the sport. My daughter's out helping with some of the spares that we have. have, like I said, I'm only bringing a certain number of horses to the Calgary Stampede. So she's out helping me train those ones at the ranch. It's the individual races. Yes, I do remember a few of those, but it all blends together. What I remember the most, crossing the finish line, being first. It's not, excuse me, it's not about the individual races. It's the team, it's the horses.
Mark, we sure appreciate you taking time to share all your experiences with us today and give us a little behind-the-scenes view into what you do and how you handle these animals. Listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this segment. Now we're going to move into our second segment of the day where we talk about somebody famous in agriculture. Now today we're focusing on the Calgary Stampede, and I thought it would be good if we took a look back at the history of the Calgary Stampede and how it was designed and organized. The Calgary Stampede was organized first by a guy by the name of Guy Weedick. He was an American cowboy, a performer, and a promoter that was known as the P.T. Barnum of the North. He founded the Calgary Stampede along with his wife, the famed cowgirl Florence Ledoux. Weedick gained financing from the Big Four. Those four men were George Lane, who was owner of the Bar U Ranch, two other wealthy ranchers, Patrick Burns and A.E. Cross, and Jay McLean, who was a provincial secretary. Now, these four men were integral in the development of Alberta, all serving in the Albertan and Canadian politics. The Big Four building at the Stampede grounds in Calgary was named for the four businessmen and once held the largest curling rink in the world. Weedick staged the first Calgary Stampede from September the 2nd through the 7th of 1912, and he did this to coincide with when the ranchers and farmers had finished harvesting and would be free to attend. And the event continues today, except it's been moved to July, and this year is the 111th anniversary of the Stampede. Weedick ran the Stampede for the first 20 years and then went on to run and promote other Wild West shows. He was a Stampede's Grand Marshal in 1952, and he passed away in 1953. He is buried in southern Alberta prairies beside his wife. Now, an interesting fact about Mr. Weedick was that he was inducted into the Rodeo Hall of Fame at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in 1976, and his wife was inducted into the National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame in 2001. So we want to thank Mr. Weedick for all his contributions to rodeo and to agriculture and for founding the original Calgary Stampede. Well, listeners, we really hope you've enjoyed this episode today where we were bringing you information about the Calgary Stampede and the rodeo and also some agronomy facts and information as well. If you need more information on anything we've covered today, you can visit our website. That's nutrien-economics.com. And I want to invite you back next week as we conclude our segments on the Calgary Stampede. We'll be discussing more about Canadian agriculture and some more famous people in Canadian agronomy. Until next time, this has been Mike Howell with The Dirt.